Okay, sounds good. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me fine. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. We have several hours of lectures to get through, so thanks for hanging in there. And let's go and get started. We're going to start by talking about obstructive sleep apnea. All right, so these are the objectives of our talk. We'll just kind of go through the physiology of sleep apnea, its consequences, symptoms, and workup of sleep apnea, and then we'll spend some time discussing medical and surgical treatment. Okay, so this kind of breaks down the categories of sleep disorders. This is not really meant to be all inclusive, but it does kind of give us a nice overview of the different categories of sleep disorders and sleep-related breathing problems. Primarily when it comes to otolaryngology and, for the purposes of our clinical practice and what we're focused on for the course, we're really focused on obstructive sleep apnea. But don't forget about insomnias, hypersomnias of central origin, such as narcolepsy, idiopathic hypersomnic disorders, circadian rhythm disorders, which sometimes we see in people that have certain types of jobs, shift workers, night workers, things like that. Parasomnias, where there's any type of different types of arousals that can occur on the EEG. We'll talk about what that looks like when we talk about the PSG and the components, sleepwalking, night terrors, and then sleep-related movement disorders such as restless leg syndrome. But parasomnia is just to kind of highlight for a second. I think it's important to kind of be familiar with what that means. These are undesirable movements or subjective phenomenons that occur during sleep and with those EEG changes. That can happen while we're falling asleep, upon awakening, or even during sleep itself. One of the things that, a type of parasomnia that you should be familiar with are sleep hallucinations. And there's two different types that we often will see. Sometimes that can be elicited on a PSG. One is a hypnagogic hallucination, and the other one is a hypnopompic hallucination. And hypnagogic usually happens just prior to the deep stages of sleep, whereas hypnopompic actually happens as we're arising out of REM right before wakefulness. And so just important to keep those in mind for parasomnic disorders. And then, sleep-related movement disorders like restless leg, we may see with people that have iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia or certain types of electrolyte abnormalities. So anything in blue that we kind of see on these slides forthcoming is something just to sort of commit to memory. And those are important for the definitions of what we both see in clinical practice and for the purposes of the course. So obstructive apnea is defined as a cessation of airflow of at least 10 seconds with an effort to breathe. And that's in contrast to a central apneic event, which has the same definition, but without that effort, because that's centrally modulated. What I'll do is I'll send something to the Osler staff that they can distribute to you guys, so you can look at what's called a sleep primer that actually has a breakdown of epochs. An epoch is a 10-second PSG that we look at to determine airflow monitor, EEG monitor. But what's important to look at when you look at an epoch or a 10-second span on the PSG is that you're looking at both the airflow monitor and the EEG line. And if both the airflow monitor and the EEG line are flat, then that defines an apneic event. But if the airflow monitor is flat, but the EEG shows some level of activity, that's a hypopneic event. So we'll describe those a little bit more in detail coming up here, but just important to kind of keep in mind the definitions between obstructive and central and how they relate to the EEG changes. So hypopnea does have a couple different definitions. There's a CMS definition, and then there's American Academy of Sleep Medicine's definition. And for our purposes, I recommend the CMS definition. And that's a 30% reduction in airflow for at least 10 seconds with a 4% oxygen desaturation. And the other definition here is either a 3% desaturation or an EEG arousal. But again, that's a hypopneic event, not an apneic event where the EEG line would be flat. So that kind of defines a hypopnea versus an apnea. So something just to commit to memory. And this is an important slide because I think when you're looking at questions and we're looking at PSGs, one of the things that we have to really look at is what is the STEM asking, what is the question asking, but also what is the type of evaluation that we're looking at the PSG. Are we really just concerned about sleep apnea, obstructive events, or are we also concerned about hypopneas, what we also call respiratory effort-related arousals or RERAs? And these occur when there's increasing respiratory efforts that result in arousal, again, an EEG change, but not meeting a criteria for an apnea or a hypopneic event. And an arousal is defined as any type of abrupt change in the EEG frequency of at least 3 seconds. And that's important because when we look at things like RDI versus AHI and upper airway resistance syndrome, which we'll also define, that's where these types of definitions really come into play versus just looking at straightforward obstructive sleep apnea syndromes and categories when we're looking at more just the AHIs. Okay, here's a definition of a couple more definitions that we should commit to memory. The AHI is simply defined as a apnea-hypopnea index, which includes both the apneas and the hypopneic events per hour of sleep. That's in contrast